This is Sir Powell, and he's got a huge problem. Sir Powell is the head of the Federal Reserve, and recently, Sir Powell faces the wrath of Uncle Don. Again, his crime? Doing his job. Oh, and not bending the knee to Uncle Don's never-ending demands. See, this feud has been brewing for years, coming to a head last year with many nasty tweets, public insults, and threats of lawsuits from Uncle Don. But this time, they weren't just threats anymore. Because a few weeks ago, Uncle Don did something unthinkable and sicked the Department of Justice on Sir Powell. Overnight, a criminal investigation was announced, and Sir Powell found himself thrust into the limelight, standing accused by the Department of Justice. The official reason for the investigation? Testimony about a building renovation. Yes, you heard that right. A building renovation that started before Sir Powell even became Fed chair, but Sir Powell isn't taking this lying down. In a rare public statement, Sir Powell took to social media and fired back at the DOJ's investigation. But that's not all. He even called the investigation a pretext to intimidate the Federal Reserve into lowering interest rates. You know, the thing Uncle Don has been begging for Sir Powell and his feds to do over the course of 2025, except that Sir Powell kept refusing his demands, much to Uncle Don's frustration. Combine this with Uncle Don's frankly insane raid in Venezuela and saber-rattling over Greenland, it's no wonder the world's markets are on edge. But why does this feud matter? Why is Uncle Don so obsessed with firing Sir Powell? And more importantly, what does this say about the future of the US jungle's economy if the Federal Reserve loses its independence? This is the Federal Reserve lawsuit explained. With how high-profile this story has become, disinformation has been more rampant than ever. And with a media landscape increasingly controlled by megacorporations, lobbyists, and political donors who have a stake in how the public views this investigation, it pays to understand where your news comes from. Ground News is a website designed to make reading the news less like doom scrolling by making it easier and more data-driven. See, Ground News curates thousands of news articles from around the jungle and lays bare biases, owners, and how sensationalized the story has become. Each story has its own dedicated visual breakdown to help monkeys understand exactly why we're seeing what we're seeing. For example, left-leaning outlets call this a thinly veiled political war, basically framing it as Uncle Don abusing power to intimidate Sir Powell and his feds. Meanwhile, right-leaning outlets focus on how this investigation would undermine the Federal Reserve's independence, emphasizing institutional norms over partisan conflict. And this is why Ground News matters. Especially now, when stories are covered in literally hundreds of different ways, it pays to have a bird's-eye view. This is especially clear when you pull up the ownership breakdown, which unveils the corpo monkeys really pulling the strings behind the scenes, giving you a full picture of which outlets are independent, publicly traded, or owned by billionaires or conglomerates. Monkey loves this because it goes beyond left and right and helps add much-needed context to major stories like this. For example, outlets owned by financial institutions might downplay the economic risks of this investigation as a whole to maintain investor confidence. Or perhaps outlets owned by political donors might amplify the partisan drama to improve public opinion of the DOJ's actions. Ground News shows you all of that up front, so you get the news without the noise. So take control of your news diet today by going to groundnews.com/monkey or by clicking the link in the description to get an exclusive 40% off their unlimited Vantage plan. Seriously, if you care about staying informed without getting played by biased coverage, this is the tool. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring this video. But before we talk about Sir Powell and his feds, what do they actually do? Basically, they're responsible for managing the economy of the US jungle by doing things like keeping prices stable, controlling inflation, and trying to maximize employment. And they've been around for a really long time, being founded all the way back in 1913. But unlike other branches of the US jungle government, they were designed to be independent from political pressure. Because letting politicians control the banana printer? Terrible idea. Except when corpo monkeys call it lobbying, I guess. But that's for another video. But specifically, among the tools the Fed has at its disposal, full video here by the way, the Fed set interest rates that affect quite literally everything in the finance world, ranging from the mortgage payments on your home to business loans. They do this by changing the Fed funds rate, their most well-known tool for monetary policy, which coincidentally is the thing that's also making Uncle Don very angry. Because this rate affects the interest rates which banks use to lend bananas to each other. Think of the Fed like a thermostat for the economy. When things get too hot, inflation rising, prices climbing, the Fed raises rates to cool things down. Borrowing gets more expensive. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards all cost more. Businesses freeze hiring or announce layoffs. But when the economy gets too cold, recession looming, jobs disappearing, they lower rates to warm it back up. Borrowing gets cheaper, monkeys buy homes and cars, businesses invest and hire, and the economy gets heated up. But there's one problem. See, politician monkeys pretty much always want low rates during their tenure because it juices the economy in the short term and makes them look good. But if rates stay too low for too long, you risk hyperinflation. And with the economy struggling right now, Sir Powell has been extremely cautious, leading to the name-calling shenanigans we see on social media. But here's the crucial part. The Fed is supposed to adjust that thermostat based on economic data, and not based on what any president wants, and that's by design. Which gives us an idea of why Uncle Don and Sir Powell can never see eye to eye. They both have fundamentally different goals. Which raises the question, how did we get from policy disagreements to criminal investigations? Because the truth is, this feud didn't start yesterday, or even last year. Uncle Don and Sir Powell have been clashing since the day Sir Powell took the job in 2018. And things have been going downhill ever since. Because remember, Uncle Don himself nominated Sir Powell in 2017, and Sir Powell was confirmed with bipartisan support. But the honeymoon period basically ended overnight. See, back in Uncle Don's first term, he immediately attacked Sir Powell whenever the Fed raised rates. Uncle Don didn't stop there, and he would compare Powell to a golfer who can't putt and demanded rate cuts on Twitter nearly every week. Come 2025, when Uncle Don returned for his second term, he upped the ante. He wanted rates slashed to 1%. Sir Powell refused. Naturally, the name-calling resumed, calling him everything from Mr. Too Late to numbskull and an absolute fool. The insults kept coming, but Sir Powell and his Fed stood their course. And don't get monkey wrong here, they don't get it right all the time. But there's something respectable about staying unbothered in the face of constant harassment. By mid-2025, Uncle Don was tweeting almost weekly about Sir Powell. But again, Sir Powell held firm. In one congressional hearing, he said something that would later seem prophetic. "We make our decisions based on data and analysis, not political pressure." That was July 2025. 6 months later, the DOJ came knocking. A criminal investigation, grand jury subpoenas, and threat of prosecution. The whole shebang, basically. But here's where it gets weird. The official reason for the investigation? Powell's testimony about a $2.5 billion banana renovation of the Fed's headquarters. Yes, you heard that right, a building renovation. Now, the DOJ accuses Sir Powell of lying to Congress about the costs, calling it the highest price of construction per square foot in the history of the world. Strong words coming from Mr. White House ballroom. But let's take a look at the facts, because this isn't the first time Uncle Don has made wild claims about this renovation. Back in July 2025, Uncle Don made his visit to the Fed headquarters. And it was awkward. With cameras rolling, Uncle Don pulled a document from his jacket pocket claiming the renovation was ballooning to 3.1 billion bananas. Sir Powell shook his head, corrected him on the spot, and handed the paper back, telling him he was inflating the numbers by adding a third building that was built 5 years ago. Ouch. Imagine getting math checked on national television. And now, 6 months later, the DOJ is accusing Sir Powell of lying about those exact same numbers. Coincidence? Regardless, the question is, how did a building renovation become grounds for a criminal investigation of one of the most powerful economic officials in the world? And more importantly, a building renovation that was approved before Sir Powell even took the job. See, the renovation was initially budgeted at 1.9 billion bananas, while the current estimate sits at 2.5 billion bananas. That's an increase, sure, but there's important context for this, and it's the COVID pandemic. Supply chain breakdowns sent the prices of wood, steel, and cement through the roof. On top of that, the buildings hadn't been renovated since the 1930s, almost a full century. We're talking asbestos removal, lead remediation, serious safety work that couldn't be skipped, and remnants of Prohibition-era construction work. But that's not even the worst part, because the renovation was approved in 2017, the year before Sir Powell became Fed chair. Construction didn't even start until 2022, 4 years into his tenure. So Powell didn't greenlight this project, he inherited it, and it's still not finished. Completion is expected in 2027. So investigating Sir Powell for this renovation is like blaming the building inspector for the architect's blueprint. Except the blueprint was approved years before he showed up. But Uncle Don claims the costs are astronomical. The highest price of construction per square foot in the history of the world. Remember? Except that's not true either. Uncle Don inflated the numbers by including a separate building, the William McChesney Martin Jr. building, which was completed back in 2020 before Powell's testimony. But even with legal pressure mounting fast, Sir Powell isn't playing along. In his public statement, he essentially said the quiet part out loud. that this new threat is not about his testimony last June or the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. Those are pretexts. In other words, this is a shakedown, dressed up in legalese. So if this isn't really about a building renovation, what's it actually about? Well, let's talk about what Uncle Don really wants from Sir Powell and why he's willing to do almost anything to get it. Because remember the rate cuts we were talking about earlier? Uncle Don has been demanding Sir Powell to lower the rate ever since his first term back in 2018. Specifically, Uncle Don wants rates to be cut to 1% or lower. That doesn't sound like much, but when you consider rates are currently set at 3.75%, this is practically an 80% drop from current levels. A mandate which Sir Powell is very, very wary of carrying out, especially considering the abysmal economy, spiraling cost of living crisis, and growing inflation. However, Uncle Don doesn't believe this is a problem, even claiming that, quote, inflation has been defeated in a triumphant press conference. All this is while the average monkey is struggling with rising costs in everything from groceries to electricity bills. But even with plummeting approval ratings, why does Uncle Don want rates slashed so badly? Two reasons: cheap borrowing and political optics. First, cheap borrowing. Because remember, lower interest rates mean cheaper loans for businesses, for home buyers, and most importantly, for the US government itself. See, the US jungle government is sitting on trillions in debt, and every percentage point the Fed keeps up results in higher costs via interest payments. So, cutting rates to 1% would be a massive windfall for his administration, and Uncle Don knows it. Second, political optics. Lower rates make it easier for monkeys to buy homes, start businesses, and spend their hard-earned bananas. That boosts the economy in the short term, which makes Uncle Don look like a genius of economic policy. It's the classic playbook. Juice the economy now, worry about the consequences later. But here's the problem. Sir Powell's job isn't to make Uncle Don, or any politician monkey for that matter, look good. His job is to keep inflation in check and protect the long-term health of the economy. And right now, slashing rates to 1% would be like throwing oil on an already raging fire. Why? Because despite what Uncle Don claims, inflation is still a problem. Prices are still rising. And if the Feds cut rates too aggressively, it risks making inflation worse than it already is. This is the painful irony of the situation. Sir Powell is doing the job he was confirmed for by the Senate, and now is being tarred and feathered by Uncle Don just because he refuses to bend the knee. Which again, is by design. The Feds were created to be independent from the government precisely for reasons like this. They're meant to be a counterbalance to ensure that the economy is guided by an institution free of political and business interests. But Uncle Don doesn't take no for an answer. He wants his rate cuts, and he wants them now. And if Sir Powell won't give them to him, he'll find someone who will. Thankfully, Sir Powell is not standing against Uncle Don alone. Former Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries issued a joint statement calling this investigation an unprecedented attempt to undermine the Fed's independence. And Madam Yellen went even further, calling this a road to a banana republic. Not to be confused with the Democratic Banana Republic, our generous channel members, of course. Even on home turf, some Senator monkeys saw the absurdity of this entire investigation and levied their own criticisms. Common monkeys are also seeing what's really going on, with a massive outpouring of support on social media, calling for the entire investigation to be canceled. So while this story is developing, monkeys can still make their voices heard by speaking to their local representatives about their concerns. Or don't. It's a free jungle after all, right? Monkey just can't help but worry. Because if inflation's bad now, God only knows how much worse it'll be under a Fed that always agrees to the demands of Uncle Don. So the next time you see Sir Powell and Uncle Don butting heads on the news, you'll know what's truly happening behind the scenes. For legal reasons, this video is just satire and is about fictional monkeys in a make-believe jungle. Please do not sue Monkey, and many thanks to the Banana Republic for generously funding and bankrolling these videos. You're all truly wonderful. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.